The Princess of Tears. Created by Deneen Priso. Roots and Rhythms African Folktales channel. I was a storyteller, known for easing heavy hearts with my tales. When the royal summons came, it felt strange. The message was vague. The king and queen sought a storyteller to soothe their sorrow. No mention of a tragedy or death, just a plea for stories. I hesitated but accepted. The moment I stepped through the palace gates, I heard it, a faint, relentless crying that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. By the time I reached the throne room, the sound was so loud it felt like it had seeped into my bones. The king and queen greeted me with weary smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Queen Sawa's voice was soft, her hands trembling as she spoke. Our daughter, Princess Isi, has not stopped crying since the day she was born. We've tried everything. Stories are all we have left. I didn't know what to say. They led me through the palace grounds to a hidden lake at the edge of the garden. The crying grew louder as we approached. When we reached the water, I froze. Floating in the lake was a child unlike any I had ever seen. Her skin shimmered like droplets of water, her hair flowing like ripples on the surface. She wasn't just in the water, she was part of it. Her small body seemed to dissolve into the lake, her hands barely visible as they reached toward the shore. And her eyes, they were like liquid, brimming with sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. This is our daughter, Isi, Queen Sawa whispered, kneeling at the water's edge. She was cursed the day she was born. The king, Adama, stood behind her, his face hard but his voice heavy with grief. When Isi was born, she was our miracle. After years of prayers and seeking mystical help, we were blessed with her. Her birth brought joy to the entire kingdom. We held a grand celebration in her honor. His voice faltered, and his fists clenched. But that was the day everything changed. They told me the story. The kingdom had gathered to celebrate Isi's birth. Among the guests was a hooded figure, a woman no one recognized. She asked to hold the baby. Reluctantly, the queen handed her over. The moment the stranger touched Isi, the baby let out a wail so piercing it silenced the room. The hooded woman smirked, and her voice rang out like a curse. You will cry, she said, until there is no more water left in your body. The guards seized the woman and dragged her away, but the damage was done. From that day forward, Isi cried without end. Her tears fell day and night, soaking everything around her. Nothing could stop her, not love, not songs, not prayers. When her small body began to weaken, the king and queen turned to a healer, desperate for a solution. The lake, the healer said. Only the water can sustain her. She must remain there. And so, they placed her in the lake. Her body transformed before their eyes, her skin becoming droplets, her form merging with the water. Since then, they visited her daily, reading her stories, celebrating her birthdays, and mourning the life she could never have. I began my work that day, sitting by the lake to tell her a story. Once upon a time, there was a girl who lived in a forest. Her crying softened, her shimmering form still as she listened. For the first time, the queen smiled, though her face was streaked with tears. You've done what no one else could, she whispered. But as the days turned into weeks, the lake began to change. The water, once clear, grew darker, murkier. Shadows began to move beneath the surface. At first, I thought they were fish, but they didn't move like fish. They swirled and shifted with purpose, like living things watching and waiting. Isi noticed them too. One evening, as I finished a story, she spoke. Her voice was soft, blending with the sound of the water. They don't like you. A chill ran down my spine. Who? I asked. She tilted her head toward the shadows beneath her. The ones who wait. The queen began visiting the lake more frequently, sitting beside the water for hours and whispering softly. I couldn't hear what she said, but her words seemed to carry a desperation that made my heart ache. The king, on the other hand, withdrew entirely, burying himself in his duties and refusing to discuss the curse. The villagers, too, began to whisper. They spoke of shadows creeping through the forests at night, of animals disappearing near the palace grounds. Some claimed to hear the princess crying in their dreams, the sounds so real they woke up in tears. The lake was no longer a secret. It was a growing fear. One evening, I confronted the king. "What's in that lake? What's happening to her?" The king's face darkened. "We don't know," he admitted. "The lake was cursed long before we placed her there. But we had no choice. It was the only way to save her." The queen, sitting nearby, clutched her hands tightly. "We thought the water would protect her," she said. "But it's taken her instead." That night, the air around the palace changed. It was heavy and suffocating, carrying a bitter chill that seeped into the bones. The shadows beneath the lake surged violently, twisting and rising higher than ever before. The queen, who had been sitting at the shore, gasped and stumbled back. I rushed to her side, but before I could ask what was wrong, I felt it too, a presence. Something old, something powerful, and something angry. A figure emerged from the forest, cloaked in darkness. The hooded robe she wore was unmistakable. The witch. Her face was sharper now, her eyes burning with a cold fire. She walked with a confidence that froze the air around her. "So," the witch said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "someone thought they could meddle with my curse." The queen rose to her feet, trembling but defiant. "You have no place here. Leave." The witch laughed, a low, chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You think you can command me after all these years? After you begged for a child and stole the life I was meant to take?" Her words sent a ripple of confusion through me. I turned to the queen, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "What is she talking about?" I asked. The witch sneered. "Did they not tell you, storyteller? This child, this cursed, wailing child, was never meant to exist. They came to me, desperate for a blessing, but they didn't like my price. So they turned to another, stealing life where they had no right." The queen shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We wanted a child. That's all. We didn't know it would bring you." The witch's gaze turned to the lake, where Isa's faint form hovered just below the surface. "And yet here she is. A child born of stolen magic. A child who cries because the balance was broken." She stepped closer, her presence making the shadows beneath the lake thrash wildly. "You thought placing her in the water would save her, but all it did was make her mine." The queen fell to her knees, sobbing. The king stood frozen, his fists clenched but his face pale. I looked at the lake, where Isi floated, her glowing figure trembling in the water. "What do you want?" I asked the witch. "Why are you here now?" The witch's sharp smile grew. "Balance must be restored," she said simply. "And that always requires sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The witch raised a hand, and the shadows surged forward, curling around Isa's shimmering form. The princess gasped, her small body writhing against the invisible chains. "No," the queen screamed, but she was powerless. The witch's voice rang out, cold and final. "The curse will end when what was stolen is returned. And if it isn't, the lake will take all of you." The water began to churn violently, the shadows pulling Isi deeper into its depths. But then, something changed. The water around Isi began to glow, faintly at first but growing brighter with each passing second. The shadows recoiled, hissing like living things in pain. The witch frowned, her eyes narrowing. "What is this?" Issa's voice, small and steady, broke through the chaos. No. You won't take him. You won't take anyone. The light around her grew blinding, and the shadows writhed in agony, retreating into the depths of the lake. The witch stumbled back, shielding her face. Impossible, she hissed. You are bound to the curse. You cannot defy it. But Issa was no longer trembling. She rose higher from the water, her small form now solid and glowing with an ethereal light. You cursed me to cry until there was no more water left in my body, she said, her voice stronger than I had ever heard it. But you never said what would happen when the tears stopped. The witch screamed, her body trembling as the light grew brighter and brighter. The shadows beneath the lake dissolved, the water stilling until it was clear once more. The witch's form began to flicker, her once powerful presence unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. Her screams grew weaker, her form shrinking as the light engulfed her. This isn't over, she shrieked one last time, but her voice dissolved into the air as she vanished, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of her words. The lake stilled, its surface now as clear as glass, reflecting the pale moonlight above. The shadows were gone, leaving the water calm for the first time in years. Issa, her body glowing softly, floated to the shore, her small form now solid and human once more. She looked fragile but alive, her breath steady as she lay in the shallows. I waded into the lake without thinking, my feet breaking the surface as I rushed to her side. She was warm against my arms, her shimmering skin replaced by soft flesh. Her eyes fluttered open as I held her, and for the first time, I saw no tears, only peace. The Queen and King ran to meet me as I carried her to the shore. Queen Sawa fell to her knees, sobbing as she reached for her daughter. Issa, she whispered, her hands trembling as they brushed the child's face. You're here. You're really here. Issa smiled faintly, her voice soft but steady. Mama. The king knelt beside them, his stoic mask breaking as tears streaked his face. He wrapped his arms around them both, his body shaking with relief. Our daughter, he murmured. Our miracle. I stepped back, giving them space to reunite. The family held each other tightly, their laughter breaking through the silence like sunlight after a storm. It was a sound I hadn't realized I had been longing to hear. The kingdom celebrated for days. News of the princess's return spread quickly, and the villagers flocked to the palace gates, singing songs of joy and lighting lanterns to guide the night. Issa, though weak, smiled and laughed, her voice filling the halls that had been silent for so long. The Queen and King, though still burdened by guilt, smiled more than they had in years, their love for their daughter reigniting their spirits. I lingered at the edges of the celebration, content to watch from the shadows. My work was done. The curse had been lifted, and the child had been saved. Yet, despite the joy around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't quite over. One evening, I found myself drawn back to the lake. The water was clear and still, reflecting the stars above like a mirror. It no longer held the darkness or the shadows that had once plagued it, but its presence was still heavy, its quiet depths brimming with something I couldn't quite name. As I stood at the edge, I thought of the witch's final words, balance requires sacrifice. They echoed in my mind, quiet but unrelenting. I had seen the light that had destroyed her, felt the power that had surged through Issa, but I couldn't help but wonder, what had truly been restored? What had been taken to make things right? The lake offered no answers. It only stared back at me, its surface calm and silent. I turned to leave, but a faint sound stopped me. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper carried on the wind. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. Kofi. The voice was familiar, impossibly so. I turned back toward the lake, my heart pounding. The water rippled faintly, though there was no breeze. My name echoed once more, carried on the stillness of the night. Kofi. I took a step closer, my breath catching in my throat. The surface of the lake shimmered, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw her, the witch, her face flickering beneath the water, her eyes watching me. And then it was gone. The lake stilled, the whisper fading into silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the water, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing came. At least, not yet. The whispers stayed with me, long after that night at the lake. At first, I convinced myself they were nothing more than echoes of my fear, shadows of the story I had been pulled into. But they grew stronger with each passing day, creeping into my dreams and curling around the edges of my waking thoughts. Kofi. Always that same voice, soft and insistent, as though it were calling me from a place just beyond the veil of reality. Like and subscribe for part 2.